The Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has requested our special task force, ANDYS, to develop a video report of countries Australian firms can expand to. We will now explore the effects of globalization on Japan and assess whether it has been a winner or a loser of globalization. We will contact experts to explore the human and economic developments within the country. We will also assess the cultural differences and challenges Australian firms may face by expanding into Japan. Finally, we will explore the theories of comparative advantage and specialization and how Japan has taken advantage of them and compared them to Australia. We will now delve into the intricacies of the Japanese economy.
Would you be able to explain how Japan's economy has recovered after World War II?
So after World War II, the Japanese populace were motivated to rebuild and regrow. So they used the resources they had, and due to the presence of America within Japan, they were able to use that connection to regrow their export connection, especially to America and to within its Asian neighbours. Also, during this time period, the Korean War was ongoing in the early 1950s, and America purchased a lot of supplies for their war effort from Japan. With their connection with the US, which grew, and their motivation, the Japanese economy regrew and was able to become the second largest in the world by 1968.
Supporting industries.
So manufacturing within the automobile industry, it has such a large presence, the third largest in the world currently, and within technology. And Japan has built itself as a quality exporter that is viewed as one of the best within their field globally. Also, it has a tourism industry that is growing since the early 2000s, where now it is expected by 2020 to have 40 million people come to their nation as tourists. It is starting to explore mining and petroleum, while it has a large fishing industry, but its agriculture industry is not on the same scale due to the limited space they have for agriculture within Japan. So Japan has a limited agriculture industry with 1.4% of its GDP being associated with this. This is why Japan has to rely on importing a lot of its agricultural goods, such as food. So Japan has lost a lot of its cultural identity to some extent. A lot of its traditional values have been modified and adapted due to the Western standard that exists. And in some instances this has been positive, as women becoming more involved in the workplace, which is a massive advantage. Another disadvantage is Japan has a massive elderly population. 26.59% of their population is 65 or over, the largest in the world. This means that their social welfare system takes a lot of pressure to look after the elderly. And one of the reasons that they have such a large elderly population and people have such a long life expectancy is that due to the improvements of their nutrition, living standards, healthcare from globalization, the average age that people die at has increased by a lot. However, from this positive, it has also taken their workforce to a much lower percent. That means that this smaller workforce has to cater and look after their large amount of working of the elderly.
So overall, do you think Japan is a winner or loser from globalization?
Overall, it is a massive winner from globalization. I've discussed previously a few negatives that have emerged, but Japan is one of the leading economies in the world. Its GDP is 384% higher than an average nation, which means their populace are able to live to a much higher standard of living and a higher quality of life.
The Japanese economy is a very fast-growing and technically advanced nation. Many great inventions are being developed there due to their advanced infrastructure, education, and innovation within the community. These 3 points are key factors in economic development and is a leading reason to their advanced lifestyles. Japan holds high value for these factors and has led to the nation being a developed country ranking moderate to high in economic measures such as their GNI, which is recorded by Fred Economic Data, which shows the GNI per capita of Japan being 22nd in the world, at 44,850 recorded in 2017. This demonstrates Japan's advanced growth, as since the economic repression, Japan's economy has boomed, with large amounts of money being invested into the economy by the government and from other nations. As recorded by Fred Economic Data, the nation's score of GNI from per capita of 27,919.90, depicting how much growth this nation has. Ranking in economic measures, Japan's human development, which is held in extremely high regard, which can be seen through their HDI, which they ranked 19 out of all nations with a score of 0.909 in 2017, which is a great increase compared to their score of 0.816 in 1990. This growth since the 90s can be explained by Japan's growth in life expectancy, mean school years completed, GNI per capita, and number of expected school years completed, which are the components that make up this GNI. With their life expectancy being 83.9 years, their expected school years to be completed at 15.2 years, their mean number of years at school being 12.8 years, and their GNI per capita being 38,986, using the 2011 purchasing power parity. This demonstrates how Japan is focusing greatly on their human development in the last few years. The measures used here are extremely useful for firms looking at establishing themselves within Japan, as it represents the economy's position and how much growth it has experienced over the past few years, which allows for the firm to determine how easily growth will be attained. However, another measure which can be used is the Human Life Index, where Japan ranks second out of 190 nations. The Human Life Index is said to be more of an accurate measure than HDI. This measure was established by the Population Development Review and co-authored by Simone Kislandi of Bocconi University in Milan. It is different due to the fact that it takes into account the inequality adjusted life expectancy at birth. Overall, an Australian firm with the goal of setting up business in Australia would need to study and analyse the nation's culture and human development. They should also be broad in the knowledge about the society of Japan. As managers preparing for multinational assignments in Japan should acquire the essential skills for strategic negotiation and cross-cultural exchange in order to achieve the expected objectives and to make lasting impressions. Studies show that the process of negotiation decision-making is culture-specific and involves a great deal of sensitivity and understanding. According to the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, for an Australian firm trying to attempt to establish in this market, they would need to follow the Japanese business etiquette and practice to be successful. This is through doing things such as being extremely polite in business meetings, showing respect and modesty towards the Japanese, and staying humble following the Japanese hard work ethic and the business hierarchy already established within this nation. Due to the economy experiencing great growth in their human development, it means Australian firms which are looking at globalisation should realise that the workforce which the firms will be using will be very skilled due to the high mean school years completed, and with a high life expectancy, it means there is large populations, which means a large number of funds within the economy, meaning growth will be easily attainable.
So there are two main similarities between Australia and Japan, the first one being education. So this is considered very important in both Japan and Australia, with many statistics being quite similar in both countries. Japan has a compulsory education duration rate of 9 years, while in Australia it is 11 years. There is an average student-to-teacher ratio of 17.5 in Japan and 17.8 in Australia, which is notably close. While teachers as a percentage of the labour force are 3% in Japan and 3.7% in Australia. Another component is the component of Hofstede's cultural dimensions. This one is masculinity versus femininity. This refers to the preference for which people have towards achievement and success, which is masculinity, against human relationships, which is femininity. Japan scored 95 out of 100, suggesting that they are an extremely masculine society. This means that they promote success and competitiveness. However, this is combined with a collectivist social structure, and so occurs more between groups rather than between individuals. In Australia, a score of 61 highlights a masculine-based culture as well. Although not as high as Japan, a focus on success is still clear. So, firstly, Japan can be regarded as a country based around a monocultural society. This means that they have one clear culture which can be easily observed. This primarily comes from the desire to actively preserve the country's national culture, particularly through limiting and excluding external influences. This is not done in a malicious way with the intention to discriminate, but rather through a concern for the possible loss of intricate historic culture and practices. Whereas Australia can be seen to be a multicultural country, as there are numerous observable cultures. This has been observed and encouraged through various government policies, such as the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975. Many Australian firms have also committed to operating in a multicultural society, with over 200 organisations signing on as supporters of the National Anti-Racism Campaign, as well as an overwhelming 86% of the population claiming to support action designed to counteract racism in the country. Furthermore, Australia's promotion of cultural diversity has been strong and effective, which has contributed to the accepting and diverse country which exists today. This can be evidenced through certain statistics. For example, 1 in 4 of Australia's population were born overseas, and 46% of residents have at least one parent who was born overseas. Now, in terms of social structure, Japan is strongly focused around collectivism, suggesting that actions and behaviours need to be based around what's good for the group rather than the individual. As a result, this has a number of implications for both individuals and businesses. A collectivist culture often results in a lack of innovation and entrepreneurialism. However, as individuals are less motivated to search for a quick profit, and this then means each individual is more loyal to the company that they're with. Whereas in Australia, the focus is on individualism. This in turn encourages people to innovate and take risks in the search of financial success. Such a social structure also suggests that employees and managers are in it for themselves, and so may be likely to move organisations if a better offer is received.
So today, can you discuss with us the differences in Japan with religion, language and uncertainty avoidance?
Sure. So firstly, religion is a big difference point between Australia and Japan. This is because the dominant religions in Japan are Shinto and Buddhism. This differs greatly when compared to the main religion of Christianity in Australia. In Japan, Christianity is a minority religion with only approximately 1% of the population claiming to be of Christian belief. With such a disparity in religions between countries, the two cultures would differ due to the behaviour, moral principles which are put forward by each religion. In terms of language, before discussing the language, it is important to acknowledge that such a term includes both verbal and non-verbal interactions. Australia's dominant and official language is English. In order to become an Australian citizen, every person must pass a citizenship test, which is issued in English and so therefore requires a relative ability to comprehend the language. Although this is due to its extensive multicultural society, there are many other languages spoken within the country in social situations. In Japan, however, Japanese is the main language spoken. This can be further separated into a large number of dialects, with Tokyo dialect being viewed as standard Japanese. However, as a similarity, almost all students graduating from high school in Japan have had multiple years of English teaching, and this is because since 2011, English became compulsory starting from the 5th grade in Japan. Japan also have a strong emphasis on non-verbal cues, which is not always present in Australia. Particularly, eye contact for long periods of time can be considered disrespectful, silence can be common in conversations, and body language and facial expressions do not change much throughout a conversation. Now, in terms of Hofstede's cultural dimensions, uncertainty avoidance is another difference. This refers to the extent to which people feel threatened by ambiguous situations. In Japan, there is a strong promotion of avoiding uncertainty at all costs. Whether this is to do with everyday life, such as planning for natural disasters, which occur a lot in Japan, or holding ceremonies for the start of the school year, or even to do with business, such as assessing all risks before making a decision. Whereas Australia can be seen to be in the middle of the continuum, there is not an emphasis on future planning or reducing uncertainty, but there is not a completely relaxed attitude towards the future or towards ambiguity either.
Young economist David Ricardo published a book called The Principles of Economy and Taxation in 1817. He theorized that countries should specialize in the products that they produce most efficiently rather than less efficiently. This was a theory of comparative advantage. This meant that despite being able to produce a good at home, countries should import goods that they produce less efficiently and specialize in the production of goods that they have an advantage in. Ricardo believed in the efficient allocation of your resources, which usually leads to higher production. This meant that if you allocated a resource, such as your workforce, to the production of a product you produce better than others, you would have a comparative advantage in that product and be able to export it to the world. He encouraged governments to support those industries through public policies, as having comparative advantage benefited the country as a whole. David Ricardo believed that by taking advantage of differences in productivity, your country could benefit from trading.
So what products does Japan have comparative advantage in?
Japan is the fourth world economy with an advanced but complex system. They are the world's fourth largest exporter, but at the same time the world's fourth largest importer. They are a prime example of Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. Japan's technological advancements and highly skilled workforce have allowed them to optimize and specialize in certain industries. The biggest export in Japan are cars and car parts. Japan has the world's third largest automobile production, with Toyota being the biggest car brand in the world. From the 1960s to 70s, Japan saw a huge boom in the exportation of their cars abroad. Their exports went from 100,000 cars in 1965 to nearly 2 million cars by 1975. By the 1990s to 2000s, Japan was the world's largest exporter of cars, with brands such as Toyota contributing significantly. With fluctuation in US production of cars and the growth of the Chinese automobile industry, Japan is now steadily placed third. Another industry in which Japan has comparative advantage are the exportation of electronic products. Products such as Sony, Nikon, Toshiba, Nintendo, Casio, and Canon are just some of the world's leading electronic brands that come from Japan. From the 1980s, Japan was a pioneer and innovator in the electronics industry. Through their innovation, they were able to climb to the top of the world's electronic markets. They are still today the world's largest electronic exporter, as they are known for their quality and innovative products.
So you talked about Japan being the world's fourth largest importer. What type of products do they import?
Yes, as Japan specializes heavily into their industries, they are left having to import goods that they produce inefficiently or unable to produce. Japan's biggest imports are energy related. They import products from crude petroleum to ample amounts of coal. Japan consumes a lot of energy due to its large infrastructure and relatively high population. It does not have large reserves of coal and petroleum. Therefore, it relies on imports from countries such as China, Australia, United States, and Saudi Arabia for its energy requirements. Globalization has helped Japan use comparative advantage to their benefit, as they are able to easily export products that they produce most efficiently, such as cars and electronics, and import products that they are unable or are not willing to produce in Japan, such as petroleum or agricultural goods. Specialization has aided Japan's economy to the prosperous country we now know today.
Australia is a country with a developed economy. They have the 14th highest GDP despite having a population of only 24.6 million people. They have taken advantage of world trade by using their comparative advantage to support their economy. Australia's exports and imports can be considered the opposite of Japan, with products such as iron ore and coal being the main export. Australia relies heavily on their mining industry. Mining accounts for 53% of Australia's exports. Since the days of the gold rush in the 1950s, the Australian mining industry has grown significantly. Today it is the world's largest exporter of coal. The government supports the mining industry through the use of subsidies and tax breaks. On the other hand, Australia's largest imports are cars and electronic goods. Transportation vehicles and electronic goods contribute to 45% of Australian imports. Manufacturing has declined significantly since the 1960s in Australia, accounting from 25% in 1960 to near below 10% today of the GDP. The Australian car manufacturing industry has also been shut down, with major brands such as Ford, Holden, and Toyota closing down their factories over the last few years. As a result, Australia relies on the importation of cars due to its inefficiencies in trade. Overall, Australia is a winner of globalization, as it has used world trade as a platform for them to become the world economic power they are today.
On behalf of DFAT, the ANDYS researchers have shown Japan is a winner of globalization, has a high level of economic and human development, possesses a few similarities between Australia's culture, but Australia and Japan have largely different cultures. We've looked at Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage and shown that Japan's comparative advantage within the car industry and the tech industry is largely different to Australia's within the mining industry.